Miss Marple finds herself drawn into a chilling mystery when a lonely conservatory hides a cry that refuses to fade. Chapter 1. A Cry at the Flower Show. The annual St. Jude's Flower Show had always been the pride of the village. Every June, the residents of Inglewood Rise would dust off their best linens, polish their tea sets, and descend in droves upon the vicarage gardens for an afternoon of bunting, blackberry cordial, and judgmental comparisons of dahlias. It was, as Mrs. Arbuthnot once said with a sniff, the one day of the year we can all pretend nothing truly dreadful ever happens in England. On this particular Saturday, the sun had taken its role seriously, casting golden light across neatly trimmed hedges and the prize marrows lined up under canvas. Miss Jane Marple, seated in a wicker chair beside the iced sponge cake competition, wore a simple straw hat with a faded ribbon and sipped elderflower cordial slowly, watching everything and everyone without appearing to watch at all. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Elaine Roper, bustled about in her rose print apron, fluttering from stall to stall like a worried robin. Her husband, Reverend Matthew Roper, had just announced the beginning of the judging for the most fragrant rose, and all eyes had turned toward Mrs. Sylvia Copeland, the reigning champion of 3 years running. Her blush-pink cultivar, Morning Devotion, shimmered delicately in a silver vase, as though it had secrets to tell. But it was not the roses that stole the attention of the crowd that day. At precisely 3:30, just as the brass band struck up God Save the King, a shriek pierced the summer air, high, sudden, and unmistakably human. Heads turned like startled pigeons. The sound had come from the conservatory adjoining the vicarage, an elegant glass andiron structure, usually reserved for orchid cuttings and over-ambitious geraniums. For a moment, no one moved. Then a few of the younger women gasped, and Mr. Henry Bostock, the parish council treasurer, muttered something and began walking briskly toward the noise. Miss Marple did not rise immediately. She simply placed her empty teacup on the edge of the cake table and folded her hands in her lap. Her eyes remained fixed on the conservatory door. Moments later, a breathless maid Florence, one of the new girls from the hall, came stumbling out, her apron wet and her face deathly pale. "There's a woman," she said, panting. She's in the sink. There's blood. The conservatory sinko. I think she's dead." Panic spread quickly. Mrs. Arbuthnot let out a theatrical sob and fanned herself with a plate. A few children began crying, and someone knocked over a tray of gooseberry tarts in the confusion. The Reverend, clearly flustered, tried to restore order, but it was like telling a murmuration of starlings to settle. Miss Marple stood at last and walked neither hurriedly nor idly toward the conservatory. By the time she arrived at the scene, a small group had gathered at the threshold but were too afraid to enter. The door stood ajar. The conservatory was sweltering, filled with the sick sweet scent of lilies and the buzzing of a trapped bluebottle. Along the far wall was a long porcelain sink, originally installed for washing pots and pruning shears. It now held something altogether different. Slumped sideways, her arms awkwardly folded beneath her, was the body of Sylvia Copeland. Her elegant summer dress was soaked through with water and something far darker. One arm hung limp over the side of the basin, fingertips brushing the tiled floor. Her signature gold brooch, a miniature watering can, still glinted on her chest, but there was no life in her glassy, open eyes. Inspector Raymond Finch arrived a short while later from Much Brenton, accompanied by a constable who looked barely old enough to shave. He was not unfamiliar with the village of Inglewood Rise. There had been a brief scandal the year before, involving poisoned rhubarb at the church bake sale, but murder was a different affair altogether. "A terrible business," he murmured, removing his hat as he entered the conservatory. He spotted Miss Marple by the windowsill, seemingly admiring a climbing vine. "And you're here already, Miss Marple? One hears things," she replied quietly. "And one does rather tend to find them interesting." He gave a rueful nod. As always, by evening, the body had been removed, the area sealed, and the townsfolk herded back to their homes with promises of further news to come. But in parlors and drawing rooms across the village, conversation buzzed like the trapped fly in the conservatory. "Window," she slipped and hit her head, insisted Mr. Bostock. "Utter nonsense," scoffed Mrs. Arbuthnot. The Copeland woman was many things, but clumsy wasn't one of them. They say she was trying to rinse her rose cuttings and found something that frightened her, offered young Dora Litchfield, eyes wide. What if she saw something? Miss Marple said nothing. She merely resumed her embroidery that evening in her parlor, lit by the gentle flicker of oil lamps and accompanied by the distant tolling of the church bell. Her needle moved in steady rhythm, though she had barely stitched a petal in an hour. She was thinking not of roses, nor of screams, but of sinks. They were curious places, she thought, designed for cleansing, for washing away the remnants of earth or food or ink. But sometimes things clung. Sometimes, even in a quiet village like Inglewood Rise, something remained behind. Blood, secrets, a whisper that no one quite heard, or a cry that no one could forget. Chapter 2. Teacups and Theoriest Morning after the flower show. Inglewood Rise was a village rearranged. The bunting still fluttered lazily in the breeze, but the mood had changed. Where once neighbors exchanged pleasantries about lemon curd and lawn care, now they lowered their voices and widened their eyes, speaking in hushed tones at hedgerows and corners. The death of Sylvia Copeland had not simply disrupted the rhythm of the village, it had fractured it. At the High Street's only grocer, Mr. Sims was already out of milk and patience. The bell above the door chimed with relentless frequency as villagers wandered in, not for groceries, but for updates. "I heard she was strangled with a string of her own pearls," whispered Mrs. Carter, her shopping basket quite empty. "Nonsense," replied the butcher's wife, Mrs. Lawley. "It was poison. Always is when it's sudden and no signs on the outside. That's how her husband died too, if you ask me. Very tidy, very fast." "She didn't have a husband," said young Leonard Sims from behind the counter. "Exactly," Mrs. Lawley said, lifting a brow. "Suspicious, isn't it?" Meanwhile, at the Blue Teacup tea room, Miss Marple sat by the window with her close friend Mrs. Weatherby, both with modest scones on delicate china. The place was unusually full for a Sunday morning, but no one seemed eager to leave. Gossip, after all, needed fuel. "Dear Sylvia," murmured Mrs. Weatherby, stirring her tea absently. "I never much liked her. One oughtn't say such things, but she had a way of speaking as if she knew everyone's faults. Terribly sharp, and always so sure she'd win. I don't think anyone else ever stood a chance at the flower show." "She took great pride in being correct," Miss Marple agreed mildly. "But it's curious, don't you think, that she should have ended up, how shall I put it, alone and quite unnoticed, in that place?" Mrs. Weatherby shuddered slightly. "And in the conservatory sink, no less. The vicar says her head was resting against the tap." Miss Marple's gaze drifted out the window, where two village boys were riding bicycles past the post office. "Yes," she said, "that must have made quite the impression." The door opened again, this time admitting Mrs. Arbuthnot, looking as though she had climbed out of a Bronte novel in full mourning regalia. "Though it had only been a single day since the death, I've come from the Ropers," she announced to the room, not bothering with a greeting. "The police were there all morning. It seems she was already dead before anyone heard her scream." A stunned silence swept through the tea room. "But then who screamed?" asked Mrs. Weatherby in a low voice. Mrs. Arbuthnot pressed a gloved hand to her chest. "Exactly my question." Miss Marple, who had until now remained almost invisible in her corner, tilted her head slightly. "I wonder if it was Florence." She did seem dreadfully shaken. The maid, Mrs. Arbuthnot, scoffed. Perhaps, but it didn't sound like a servant's scream. It sounded like someone trying to be heard. That afternoon, Inspector Finch held a brief statement on the vicarage steps. His mustache bristled with discomfort as he addressed the curious crowd. There is, at this stage, no cause for panic. Mrs. Copeland's death is under investigation. The exact cause is yet to be determined, and we ask that any residents with useful information come forward. Was it murder, Inspector? Someone called. There are irregularities, Finch admitted reluctantly, but no official conclusions, as the villagers murmured and dispersed. Miss Marple stood to one side, her expression unreadable. She had noticed something at the flower show, something no one had commented on. Earlier that afternoon, before the scream, Mrs. Copeland had been seen arguing with Charles Denning, a new rival in the village. Charles had inherited the old mill cottage from a distant uncle and was, by all accounts, handsome, elusive, and rarely seen at Sunday service. The two had stood under the pergola in heated conversation. Sylvia's face flushed. Denning's jaw clenched. Miss Marple had only caught the tail end of it, but she remembered Sylvia's words clearly. If you think I'll let you take that from me, you're mistaken. There was also the matter of the letter. Mrs. Copeland had been seen posting one the day before the flower show, a rare thing, as she generally handled correspondence with great discretion. Florence, the maid, had mentioned it in passing. She seemed awfully tense about it. Said it had to go that very day, no matter what. Miss Marple, seated once more in her parlor by twilight, let her knitting rest in her lap. She reflected on the scream, the time it was heard, the peculiar echo it left, and the curious positioning of the body in the sink. People did not collapse into sinks unless they were put there, and people did not scream in a way that startled the entire garden unless they wanted attention. Unless something had gone terribly wrong. A knock at her door roused her. It was young Dora Litchfield, clutching a scarf and looking pale. I hope I'm not disturbing you. Miss Marple, not at all, dear. Do come in. I remembered something, Dora said hesitantly. From yesterday. I didn't think it was important, but Miss Marple nodded, waiting. Well, I went to the conservatory before the judging, just for a moment, and I saw Mr. Denning come out. He looked rather flushed, and he was wiping his hands with a handkerchief. I thought he might have been pruning something, but he wasn't carrying any tools. Interesting, Miss Marple said, pouring tea. And the handkerchief? He tucked it in his pocket, quickly. I remember because he did it when he saw me. Miss Marple offered a gentle smile. Thank you, dear. You were quite right to come. As Dora left, Miss Marple stood at her window. The village looked perfectly peaceful, foxgloves swaying in the breeze, smoke curling from chimneys, the quiet hush of dusk settling over rooftops. But there was something beneath it all, a faint shadow stretching from the conservatory sink to every polite parlor and gossiping tea-room, a secret that someone had tried too late to rinse away, and Miss Marple, ever patient, ever listening, had begun to hear its outline in the silence between teacups. Chapter 3. The gentleman in the pergolate village of Inglewood Rise had never seen such an appetite for mystery. Even the discovery of a fox in the baker's larder the previous spring had not produced such ceaseless murmuring. Now every household buzzed with speculation, theories changing as quickly as teacups were refilled. Inspector Finch, meanwhile, was not enjoying himself in the least on trying to conduct an investigation. He told Reverend Roper grimly that Monday morning, after another fruitless round of interviews, "But I've heard more about Mrs. Copeland's marrying recipe than I have about her movements that day. She was admired," said the Reverend politely, "but not beloved." Finch snorted. "I gathered as much." One name, however, kept reappearing on the lips of those closest to the incident: Charles Denning. Denning was, in many ways, an outsider. Since moving into the old mill cottage 4 months ago, he had kept mostly to himself, with only occasional appearances at the pub or walking the bridle path with a notebook. Some said he was a writer. Others claimed he was recuperating from something vaguely tragic. His clothes were always well-fitted, but never ostentatious, and his smile, when it did appear, was more polite than warm. On the morning following Mrs. Copeland's death, Denning received a visitor. Miss Marple, ever courteous and unassuming, arrived with a small basket of scones, a little village custom, she explained. When something dreadful has occurred, and one wishes to maintain appearances. Denning received her with mild surprise and gestured her inside. "Thank you," he said, accepting the basket, but eyeing her with a caution not unlike a cat eyeing a bowl of cream. "I didn't realize I was part of the morning circuit." Miss Marple smiled gently. "You were seen speaking with Mrs. Copeland on the day of the flower show." "Briefly," he replied. "She had rather strong opinions on pruning techniques, and she took exception to something I'd said about hybrid roses." "Did she now?" Miss Marple's voice was mild, but her gaze did not waver. "I believe she was quite fond of winning, in all aspects of life." Denning gave a short laugh and moved to pour her tea. "Yes, I rather got that impression." He handed her a cup and sat opposite. The sitting room was tasteful but Spartan leather chair, dark wood desk, a few books neatly stacked on a shelf, no signs of disorder, but also none of sentiment. "I understand she died in the conservatory," Denning said finally, his tone careful. Miss Marple inclined her head. "Quite so. In the sink, no less." He frowned. "Unusual, very." She sipped her tea in silence for a moment, then added, "A maid heard the scream. Quite a terrible one, by all accounts. But the pathologist believes Mrs. Copeland was already dead by then." Denning looked up sharply. "So the scream wasn't hers?" "It seems not." He tapped his fingers against the porcelain saucer. "Strange village," he murmured. "So much sound, so little clarity." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Sometimes clarity comes not from what people say, but from when they say it, or when they don't." A silence passed between them, companionable only on her side. Then she added, lightly, "I did hear that you were seen leaving the conservatory shortly before the incident, without tools." Denning froze for just a moment, barely noticeable. "But there. I stepped in to escape the heat," he said. "It was stifling in the garden." "It was indeed," she said, not missing the deflection. "I didn't see anyone inside." "Not even Mrs. Copeland?" "No." A pause. "Was she there then?" Miss Marple smiled gently, but offered no reply. She finished her tea and rose, thanking him with all the polite formality of an elderly aunt who had asked nothing more than to borrow a cup of sugar. He saw her to the door, and as she stepped onto the path, he added, "You think I had something to do with it?" "I think," said Miss Marple softly, "that everyone has something to do with everything in a village like this." Back in the heart of the village, Florence the maid had taken ill. She's refused to leave her room. Mrs. Roper told Miss Marple that same evening, her apron still dusted with flour. "Keeps muttering about the scream. I think she may have been more frightened than she let on." "Has she said anything else?" "Only that she dropped a vase when she ran in. But I can't find one missing." Miss Marple made a note of that. Later that evening, she strolled to the conservatory once more. It had been cordoned off, but a kindly word to Constable Hill, who had always found her advice oddly helpful, secured her a few minutes alone. The glass panes threw long shadows as the sun dipped. The porcelain sink was clean now, scrubbed and sterile. But Miss Marple didn't look at the sink. She looked at the windowsill. A faint smudge, almost invisible to the eye, marred the surface. Floral residue, perhaps, or something else. And tucked just beneath a cracked tile, nearly hidden from view, was the glint of something gold. She lifted it gently, a small pin, shaped like a watering can. A duplicate of the brooch Sylvia Copeland had been wearing at the flower show. Only this one was bent, its clasp twisted, as though ripped from fabric in haste. Miss Marple placed it into her reticule and exited silently. In the distance, the church bell began to toll for evening prayer. But in her mind, the scream echoed again, not just a sound, but a warning. Someone had screamed, not in panic, in protest or regret, and someone else had heard it and chosen silence. Miss Marple, ever patient, ever listening, now had a smudge, a scream, and a gentleman who did not prune but wiped his hands all the same. Chapter 4. A rose, a letter, and a Libby. Tuesday morning. The hum of bees over the rose beds was drowned out by the steady whisper of speculation. The postmistress, Mrs. Culpeper, had taken to opening and closing the same ledger in her office, not for its contents, but because it gave her an excuse to linger by the front counter, where each villager brought their theory along with their letters, and everyone had one. "I heard she had an affair," said Miss Litchfield with theatrical gravity, "with a man from London. She was going to run away with him." "No, no," murmured Mr. Barnes the clockmaker, tapping his watch with a tiny brass tool. "It was a quarrel over land. Denning's uncle left him more than the cottage. There's money in that soil. She wanted it, and he refused. Or she discovered something she shouldn't have," added Mrs. Carter, lowering her voice as she reached for her change. "Something wicked." By mid-morning, Miss Marple had finished a loop through the village, polite hellos here, gentle observations there, and stopped by the post office with a specific purpose. Not gossip, but the letter. "Mrs. Culpeper," she said, peering over her spectacles, "do you recall Mrs. Copeland posting anything on Friday?" The postmistress blinked. "Oh yes, she brought a single envelope, rather thick. Insisted it go first post. Stamped it herself, handed it over with both hands like it contained something precious. Do you remember the address?" Mrs. Culpeper's eyes gleamed. "Well now, I shouldn't." Miss Marple waited patiently, hands folded neatly on her handbag. "But I do recall it was to a solicitor in Oxford. Braithwaite and Meldrum, I believe." Miss Marple smiled. "Thank you, my dear." By that afternoon, she had telephoned the firm. It was, of course, unusual to make inquiries, but her reputation, as the vicar once said, was strangely persuasive. "Yes," confirmed the clipped voice on the other end. "We received Mrs. Copeland's envelope on Saturday. It contained revisions to her will. May I ask the nature of the revisions?" There was a pause. Her estate was left to a Mr. Charles Denning, in full. It was previously divided among 3 distant cousins. Miss Marple thanked him and replaced the receiver with deliberate care. So Sylvia Copeland, unmarried and seemingly solitary, had made a decisive move just before her death. She had altered her will to benefit Charles Denning completely, and she had not lived to speak of it. That same afternoon, Inspector Finch stopped by Miss Marple's cottage. He looked more harried than usual, and his collar was slightly askew. "I've just had an unpleasant chat with Charles Denning," he said, accepting a biscuit without enthusiasm. "Turns out he was in the conservatory during the window in question. Claims he left before anything occurred." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And the will?" Finch blinked. "How did you?" "I asked the postmistress. She remembered the letter. One simply follows the threads, Inspector." Finch frowned. "The timing is uncomfortable. She changes her will, she argues with him, then she's found dead, and he says he was nearby but saw nothing." He rubbed his temples. "And yet, there's no cause of death. No bruises, no wound, just a woman in a sink." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "I have found, Inspector, that the most telling wounds are not always visible, especially when one knows precisely where to press." That evening, Miss Marple attended a quiet supper at the vicarage. The Ropers were gracious, if distracted, and a few others had been invited for civility's sake. Mr. Bostock, Dora Litchfield, and young Leonard Sims made a curious but talkative group, chattering about anything except the murder. Until, of course, they couldn't help themselves. "Do you suppose the brooch means anything?" asked Dora, lowering her voice. "The one she was wearing?" "I heard there were two of them," said Leonard, glancing at Miss Marple. "Didn't you say, Miss, that you found one in the conservatory?" Miss Marple smiled politely. "I found something very like one, yes. But who can say if it belonged to Mrs. Copeland or not? I believe the design was a gift she gave to the Garden Society once. It's possible more than one person owns such a pin." A silence fell. "I have one," said Mr. Bostock suddenly, his voice brittle. "She gave them to committee members last year. 5 of us in total, if I recall. Hers, me, Mrs. Arbuthnot. Denningham was a special guest speaker, and Florence the maid." All heads turned. "She gave one to the maid?" Leonard asked, incredulous. "She was fond of Florence," said Bostock. "Said she had clean instincts, whatever that means." Miss Marple sat quietly for a moment. Then, with an expression of mild curiosity, she asked, "Mr. Bostock, were you present when the scream was heard?" He nodded. "Near the rose tent. Heard it plain. Gave me quite a jolt." "You think it meant something specific?" "I think," Miss Marple said gently, "it always does. That night, a storm rolled quietly through Inglewood Rise. Rain tapped on cottage roofs like a whisper trying to become a shout. In her own sitting room, Miss Marple sat unmoving, her knitting forgotten in her lap. Sylvia had changed her will. Denning had been close to close. There were 2 brooches, perhaps more, and one had turned up broken, hidden, and the scream had come after death, or rather after the act. It had not been a shriek of terror, it had been a cry of conscience. Miss Marple closed her eyes and saw it. The conservatory, silent and blooming. A basin not meant for death. A figure alone or not. And then a sound human, raw, unmistakable. She was close now, not to solving it, but to seeing what had been missed. For Miss Marple knew something few others did. In a village, people rarely lie outright, but they often omit. And behind every omission lies a reason, and reasons, like roots beneath roses, have a way of surfacing. Chapter 5. The maid who wouldn't sleep. Following morning brought a gray drizzle to Inglewood Rise, softening the edges of cottages and leaving the hedgerows damp and shimmering. It was the sort of weather that clung to one's mood, leaving everything slightly blurred, slightly tense. In the vicarage kitchen, the kettle whistled high and urgent, and Miss Marple, seated across from Mrs. Roper, accepted her second cup of tea without fuss. "She still won't come down," Mrs. Roper said, shaking her head. "Florence, I mean. I tried to coax her out this morning with toast and marmalade. Nothing. Poor girl," said Miss Marple thoughtfully. "How long has she been with you now?" "Just over 6 months. From Bexhill. Quiet as a mouse at first, but good with her hands, and so tidy. I just promoted her to housemaid from scullery. Sylvia said she had an instinct for cleanliness." Miss Marple sipped gently. "And they were close, Sylvia and Florence." Mrs. Roper hesitated. It was odd. Sylvia was particular about who she tolerated, but with Florence, she seemed kind. "I once caught her giving the girl a little gardening booklet, quite old and full of handwritten notes. Told her it's not just what you plant, it's what you listen to." "How curious," murmured Miss Marple. "May I speak with her?" Mrs. Roper hesitated. "If she'll allow it. Let me go up." 10 minutes later, Miss Marple was led up the narrow stair to the smallest bedroom. Tucked under the eaves, Mrs. Roper knocked softly. "Florence, dear, it's Miss Marple. Just for a quick word." There was a pause. Then, slowly, the door creaked open. Florence stood with her back to the window, pale and drawn. Her eyes, dark with fatigue, looked older than her years. She clutched a threadbare shawl around her shoulders and said nothing. "May I come in?" Miss Marple asked gently. The girl nodded once. Inside, the room was neater, perhaps, than any servant's room had reason to be. The bed was crisply made. A single vase of withering lilies stood on the windowsill. "I heard you've not been sleeping," Miss Marple said, settling on the edge of the chair by the wall. Florence gave a slow nod. "Would it help to speak of what you saw?" "I didn't see anything," she whispered. Miss Marple's eyes never left hers. "But you heard something." Florence looked down at her hands, wringing them slowly. "I was bringing in clean linen from the line, just past the greenhouse. I saw Mrs. Copeland go inside the conservatory. She looked, I don't know, angry, like someone who'd made up her mind. And then, I didn't follow straight away. I went to the kitchen first to fold the cloths. Maybe 5 minutes. Then I heard, not a scream, more like a sob, sharp, like someone had been trying not to cry and then couldn't hold it in." Miss Marple leaned forward. "And when you entered the conservatory?" "She was there, in the sink. Her arms were twisted, like someone had tried to lay her down gently, and then panicked. There was water running, and her brooch was gone. You noticed that?" Florence nodded. "She always wore it to the flower show." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Florence, did you scream?" "No," the girl said, almost inaudibly. "I wanted to, but my throat froze. I dropped a vase on the tiles. That's what they heard, I think." Miss Marple was silent a moment, then asked, "Do you still have the gardening booklet she gave you?" Florence reached under her pillow and drew it out, a soft-covered volume, faded with age. The front bore no title, only a pressed violet taped to the inside cover. The handwriting was unmistakably Sylvia Copeland's. Miss Marple turned through the pages slowly. Notes in the margins spoke of pruning rhythms, lunar patterns, and peculiar symbols next to specific flower types, marks that might have meant nothing to most, but spoke of Sylvia's particular brand of obsessive care. And on the final page, a phrase stood out. "In truth, the roses know. If I die, begin with the roots." Miss Marple's fingers paused. That evening, at the village pub, Charles Denning was seated alone in the corner, nursing a scotch and barely touching his steak and kidney pie. Conversation hushed as he entered and never quite recovered. A group of older men threw glances in his direction. Younger ones averted their eyes entirely. Leonard Sims, emboldened by the presence of his mates, leaned over with a smirk. "Strange, isn't it? The way the Newell dropped you right into the middle of things." Denning looked up slowly. "I beg your pardon?" "The inheritance," Leonard said, trying to sound casual. "Bit of luck, that. Did you know she was changing it?" "I didn't," Denning replied coolly, "and I'm not interested in it. Come off it. She didn't hand over all that money out of the blue." Denning's eyes narrowed. "What are you implying?" Leonard leaned back, feigning innocence. "Nothing at all. Just funny, that's all. You were the last to see her, and now," Denning stood abruptly, "I've had enough of this village rot. If you want to accuse me, do it to my face. Otherwise, keep your gossip to your teacups." He left in silence, the door swinging behind him with a sharp clap. From the other end of the pub, Miss Marple, unnoticed in her dark blue shawl, watched him go. She rose moments later and stepped outside into the cool night air. The storm had cleared, but something else was building, something human, a kind of pressure. She could feel it rising in the small shifts of behavior, the maid's haunted silence, the boy's boldness, Denning's unraveling composure. Back in her cottage, she returned to the gardening book and laid it beside the broken brooch from the conservatory windowsill. Then, gently, she placed a pressed violet from her own garden next to the one inside the cover. They were identical, and Miss Marple, with a faint sigh, whispered aloud, "If I die, begin with the roots." Double quotes. Yes. She would. Chapter 6. The Root of the Matterby Wednesday. Inglewood Rise was no longer whispering, it was hissing. The polite murmurs of the village had curdled into suspicion, and suspicion, as Miss Marple well knew, was a weed that grew faster than honesty ever could. The flower show bunting had not yet been taken down, and now fluttered limply in the damp wind like the remnant of a celebration gone sour. In every parlor, someone was offering tea, and someone else was suggesting that Denning had either done it or knew who had. And always, there was a mention of that poor girl Florence who seemed, depending on who was telling the story, either a frightened innocent or the keeper of some dreadful secret. Miss Marple took her morning walk past the Copeland cottage, a modest home tucked between rose-covered arches and a clipped box hedge. A black ribbon still hung from the gate latch, a somber touch amid the bloom. She didn't pause. Not yet. Instead, she made her way to the garden society. Shed behind the vicarage, the same shed where Sylvia Copeland had spent hours each week, tending to her prized cuttings and dictating orders to lesser green thumbs. Miss Marple had asked Mrs. Roper's blessing to poke about, and had received it with a wave of the hand and the remark, "If anyone can make sense of this tangle, it's you." The shed smelled of loam and turpentine, and the air held the hush of places where secrets have settled undisturbed. Along the back wall stood rows of labeled seed tins, each marked with Sylvia's impeccable hand. On the bench was a half-finished potting tray, tiny flecks of rose petals still clinging to the rim. And in the corner sat a wooden crate with more gardening books, Sylvia's library of method, all annotated in the same sharp script. Miss Marple sorted through them, noting which volumes bore the pressed violet mark, Sylvia's symbol. She now suspected, for something hidden or protected. 3 books had it. One, tucked behind a shelf panel, was the most heavily marked. She opened it and found not gardening notes, but correspondence. Tucked within the pages were letters, copies of letters Sylvia had sent, most addressed to Braithwaite and Meldrum, the solicitors. But one, faded and worn, was addressed not to them, but to a woman named Clara Eves. The name rang a bell. Miss Marple returned to her cottage at once and fetched an old church bulletin from a drawer. Clara Eves had been mentioned years ago, Sylvia's cousin. The two had fallen out over something never spoken of directly, and Clara had moved to Yorkshire. The letter was brief and dated 3 weeks ago. "Clara, I've made the change. I know you won't agree, but I've no intention of letting Charles suffer for his father's sins. He may not know the whole truth, but I do. This is the best I can do to correct the past. Sylvia." Miss Marple sat for a long time, the letter in her lap, the wind brushing softly against the curtains. The pieces were beginning to settle, not clearly, not yet, but into a shape, a correction, a legacy, a silence that had been meant to lift, but had instead descended forever. She returned to the village in the afternoon and found Inspector Finch outside the pub, talking with Constable Hill. "I was just about to call on you," he said, greeting her with a grim nod. "You may as well know we've ruled out natural causes." "Ah," Miss Marple said softly, "no wounds, no poison in the usual sense, but the pathologist thinks it may have been pressure applied to the back of the neck, in just the right way. Something deliberate, quiet, deliberate," Miss Marple echoed. "Yes, I rather thought so." Finch squinted. "You've found something, haven't you?" "Not something, someone." That evening, the village hall was unusually full for the Garden Society's postponed committee meeting. Some believed it a chance to return to normalcy. Others came because their curiosity wouldn't let them stay away. Miss Marple, ever unassuming, sat in the front row with her knitting in hand. Charles Denning arrived late, looking sallow and weary. Florence did not appear. Mr. Bostock called the meeting to order with a forced joviality. It was halfway through a discussion on the replanting of the east-facing beds that Miss Marple stood and asked, would it not be prudent, before replanting, to clear the roots of what remains? One never knows what might still be tangled beneath. The room fell silent. Mr. Bostock blinked. "I beg your pardon." She stepped forward, her voice calm. "Sylvia Copeland once wrote, 'If I die, begin with the roots.'" I believe she meant us to look at what was beneath the surface, not only in the soil, but in people. Denning shifted in his chair. "You see," Miss Marple continued, "what matters is not only who Sylvia left her estate to, but why. There was something she had tried to atone for, something that linked her to Mr. Denning far more deeply than the village knew." Denning's jaw clenched. "She wasn't family, no," said Miss Marple. "But your father was. Sylvia's cousin. The one who disgraced himself and disappeared when you were a boy." Denning's eyes widened. "She knew," Miss Marple said gently. "She knew, and she chose not to tell you. Instead, she tried to make it right, quietly, legally. But someone else knew too, someone who thought Sylvia's silence wouldn't last." Across the room, Mr. Bostock's hand had tightened on the back of a chair. Miss Marple turned. "You were the only other person who knew about the will. You were on the committee. You had access to her papers, and you knew that if she named Charles as heir, questions would rise, questions that would expose not only a family scandal, but your own investments tied up with Sylvia's property. You couldn't afford that." Bostock's face had turned a ghastly shade. "It wasn't the scream that gave you away," Miss Marple said. "It was the fact that someone screamed at all. Sylvia was already gone. Florence was too frightened. The scream came from someone else, someone who saw what happened and couldn't live with it." A silence fell, and then, slowly, the door at the back opened. Florence stood there, trembling, her shawl clasped tightly around her. "I saw him," she whispered. "He followed her in. I watched through the side glass." Inspector Finch rose, and Mr. Bostock slumped into his seat. "Close his eyes. I only meant to frighten her," he said, voice hollow. "She wouldn't listen. She said it was too late." Miss Marple sighed. "But it never is," she murmured. "Too late to tell the truth." And outside, under the soft haze of rain, the roses stood in silence, rooted, waiting, blooming again. Chapter 7. Secrets in the tea leaves. In the days that followed the arrest of Mr. Bostock, a strange quiet fell over Inglewood Rise, not the tense hush of suspicion, but a breathless sort of silence, as though the village itself were unsure how to resume its routines. The flower show bunting was finally taken down, with neither ceremony nor complaint. Sylvia Copeland's roses, left untended, began to bow beneath their own weight, their velvety heads dipping as if in mourning. Miss Marple, however, did not retreat into comfort or embroidery, as some might have expected. She continued her gentle walks, her subtle inquiries, and her soft listening over cups of tea because, though Bostock had confessed, something still rang false. His explanation had been vague, his remorse too conveniently timed. And Miss Marple, who had seen many men lie to save themselves, suspected a deeper root remained. On a quiet Thursday afternoon, she took tea at the home of Dora Litchfield and her mother, Mrs. Litchfield. Their sitting room was done up in forget-me-nots and lace, with a framed photograph of a young soldier atop the piano and an embroidered cushion that read, "There's no place like home." Dora poured nervously. "Sugar, Miss Marple." "Just a half-spoon, dear." Mrs. Litchfield leaned in, as though sharing a prayer. "It's been dreadful, hasn't it? Poor Sylvia. And Bostock, of all people. Who would have thought?" "Did you know them well?" Miss Marple asked, stirring slowly. "Oh, not closely," Mrs. Litchfield said quickly. "Sylvia was always a bit superior, wasn't she, Dora?" Dora nodded. "She didn't like when people pruned their roses too early. She said ours were undisciplined." Miss Marple smiled. "And Mr. Denning?" Both women paused. "I don't trust him," said Mrs. Litchfield bluntly. "There's something secretive about him. Too polished, if you ask me. He walks late at night," Dora added. "I've seen him go past our garden with a torch. Not just once, Miss Marple lifted an eyebrow. Perhaps he finds the village too small for daytime escape. Dora hesitated. The thing is, after the flower show, I saw him outside the Copeland house, just standing there, looking up at the bedroom window. I thought it strange, but then I remembered the will. Miss Marple's spoon stopped. He never spoke to Sylvia about it, she said, more to herself than to the Litchfields. Mrs. Litchfield leaned forward. What was that, dear? But Miss Marple was already rising. Forgive me, I must be going. I've just remembered something I left steeping too long. She made her way back to her cottage, where a stack of papers sat by the hearth. Among them was a copy of Sylvia's last will. Inspector Finch had let her see it, though not officially. She read it again, slowly, under the warm lamplight. To Charles Denning. I leave the whole of my estate in gratitude for his patience and silence. Silence. Miss Marple tapped the word gently with her finger. It was a strange phrase, in gratitude for his patience and silence. It spoke of something known but unspoken, something held back, and Denning had not asked about the will. Not once, not even when suspicion bloomed around him like mold. He had not protested. He had not defended himself. That was what had troubled her, not guilt, but knowledge. She rose the next morning and paid a visit to Denning's cottage. The door creaked open slowly when she knocked. He looked pale, drawn, as though sleep had been lost to thought. I wondered when you'd come, he said. Everyone else has. I'm not here to question you, Miss Marple replied softly. I'm here to listen, in case you're ready to stop being silent. He stepped aside, and she entered the sitting room once more. The curtains were drawn, and the kettle whistled low in the background. A book sat open on the desk, The Language of Flowers. You knew she'd changed the will, Miss Marple said gently. He nodded. Double quotes, she told me a week before the flower show. Said it was time someone did right by the past. And did you agree? I didn't want it, he said quickly. The house, the land, it wasn't about that. I just wanted her to stop pretending. Miss Marple waited. She raised me, in a way. After my father left, Sylvia made sure I went to school, paid for my books, sent money to my mother even when she was furious with us both. But she never once told me why. Miss Marple sat down slowly. And your father? Denning stared into the distance. He was your brother. The silence settled between them, old and bitter. She thought I didn't know. But I did. I always did. I just wanted her to say it. Miss Marple exhaled softly. And Mr. Bostock? Denning's expression changed. He wanted to stop the will from being made public. Said it would disgrace everyone. Said the property should stay in clean hands. Miss Marple folded her hands. So he confronted her. Yes, but she wasn't frightened of him. She told him to leave. I was nearby, I heard them. She said, you've protected your little secrets long enough. Now I'm protecting mine. And afterward, I left. I couldn't bear it. The next I heard, she was dead. Miss Marple looked up. You didn't scream. He shook his head. I ran. Like a coward. Miss Marple rose, her gaze gentle. Courage takes many forms, Mr. Denning. Silence is not always weakness. But you must know Bostock's confession doesn't explain everything. Denning frowned. What do you mean? Miss Marple looked toward the door. I believe there was someone else in the conservatory that day. Someone neither of you saw. And she was certain, now more certain than ever, that Sylvia Copeland's death had more than one root. One of guilt and one of fear. Chapter 8. The rose that wasn't entered. Sunday came with a hesitant sun, peeking shyly through the thinning clouds as if unsure it was welcome. Inglewood Rise was quiet, but not peaceful. The village was holding its breath. Though Mr. Bostock remained in custody, his confession hadn't loosened the air in the drawing rooms, or softened the conversations in the shops. If anything, things had grown touter, because something still didn't fit. Miss Marple walked early that morning, taking her usual route along the narrow lane that curved behind the vicarage, and past the Copeland cottage. The garden, once Sylvia's pride, now looked unnervingly overgrown. Without her precise hand, the roses had begun to wander, but one bush, near the far side wall, still bloomed with unnatural vigor. A rose that had not been entered in the show. Miss Marple paused. It was a cultivar she hadn't noticed before, deep crimson petals with feathered white tips, so vivid it nearly startled her. Tied to its stem was a small, rusted gardening tag, its lettering barely legible. She leaned in. C.D. Charles Denning. Miss Marple stood very still. She remembered Mrs. Weatherby's idle remark at the tea room a week earlier. Sylvia never entered more than one rose per show. Said it would be unfair competition, so why hadn't this one been entered? She plucked the deadhead from a lower branch and tucked it into her coat pocket. Back in her cottage, she set the rose gently on the table beside the broken brooch and the copy of the will. The pattern was emerging now, slow as embroidery, but sharp as a needle. Sylvia Copeland had been planning something long before the flower show. Something not just about inheritance but recognition. She had planned to name Denning as her heir. She had written to her estranged cousin, and she had grown a rose in his name when she never showed, because she didn't want anyone to see it just yet. Miss Marple stared at the flower a long while, then rose and went straight to Florence. The maid was now staying at the vicarage on Mrs. Roper's insistence. Though pale and quiet, she had begun to emerge from her shell in slow increments, like a plant coaxed out of frost. Florence opened the door to her room with a wary look. "Yes, I won't keep you long," Miss Marple said. "I've brought you something." She held out the rose. Florence blinked, unsure. "I found it behind Sylvia's house," Miss Marple said softly. Tied with a tag marked C.D. Florence took it gingerly, eyes widening. "She told me about this one. Said it was a tribute. Something personal. Did she ever tell you why it was kept hidden?" The maid nodded slowly. "She said some things need time to bloom, and some truths shouldn't be forced into the light until they're strong enough to stand there." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Did she know she was in danger?" Florence hesitated. "She was nervous the last week. Told me not to let anyone into the conservatory without her permission, but she wouldn't say why." Miss Marple paused, then said, "You weren't the one who screamed, were you?" Florence flinched. "No," she whispered. "I saw someone else. Just a glimpse. Through the side glass." After Mr. Bostock had gone, Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "Can you describe them?" "I thought it was Dora Litchfield." Florence bit her lip. She was wearing a pale yellow blouse and one of those little floral scarves she ties at her neck. She looked startled, like she'd seen something she wasn't supposed to. "Are you certain it was her?" Florence nodded. "I saw her again the next day wearing the same blouse." Miss Marple rose with a quiet sigh. "Thank you, my dear. That was very brave." She left the vicarage and walked directly to the Litchfield home. Dora answered the door herself, looking startled to see Miss Marple at the threshold. "Oh, Miss Marple, I wasn't expecting Mother's out. I came to see you," Miss Marple said gently. Dora stood aside, letting her in without protest. The sitting room was tidy, every cushion perfectly fluffed. Miss Marple took a seat and folded her hands in her lap. "You were in the conservatory, weren't you?" she said quietly. Dora's face went pale. "I don't know what you mean. I think you followed Sylvia that day. Perhaps you saw Mr. Bostock go in, and then leave. But instead of leaving yourself, you stayed. Long enough to witness something you were never meant to." Dora stood frozen. "I believe you saw her collapse," Miss Marple said. "Whether by someone's hand or by her own frailty, you panicked. You screamed. And then you ran." A pause. "Then, I didn't mean to," Dora whispered. "I didn't mean to see it." Miss Marple's voice softened. "What did you see?" Dora looked down at her hands. "I saw her arguing with someone. Not Mr. Bostock, A woman. She had a scarf like mine, but darker. They were shouting about something papers. And then Sylvia just crumpled. Miss Marple sat back, her expression unreadable. A woman? She asked. Dora nodded. She was older. I thought maybe her cousin. She left through the side door, fast. I didn't recognize her then, but I do now. Miss Marple's breath caught. Clara Eves. Dora nodded again. She came back, didn't she? Miss Marple whispered. Dora said nothing, but her silence was answer enough. Miss Marple left not long after, the mist thickening as she walked. So Clara Eves had returned, and she had come not to reconcile, but to stop Sylvia from rewriting the past. Chapter 9. A return unannounced. Mist lingered over Inglewood Rise well into the afternoon, softening hedges and muffling footsteps like an old memory that refused to fade. Miss Marple, walking briskly with her umbrella closed at her side, did not turn toward her cottage, but instead made her way directly to the post office. There were questions still to ask, and if the path was finally clearing, she needed to be sure every route was turned over. Mrs. Culpeper looked up from her ledger and offered a tight smile. Another storm, perhaps, she said, nodding toward the sky. Miss Marple responded with her usual warm politeness before leaning slightly on the counter. Mrs. Culpeper, I wonder if you could help me confirm something. Do you recall anyone else posting to or receiving post from Miss Clara Eves? The postmistress's brow furrowed, and she adjusted her glasses. Clara Eves, that's Sylvia's cousin, isn't it? From Yorkshire? Miss Marple nodded. Mrs. Culpeper thought for a moment. Now that you mention it, there was a woman, week before last, who came in just after the Morning Post left, asked about Sylvia Copeland, didn't give a name, looked a bit, well, serious, refined, I'd say. Did she send anything? Mrs. Culpeper squinted toward the drawer where she kept carbon copies. A telegram, I think, to Sylvia, marked private, urgent. She paid in cash. Do you recall the message? Oh, no, she said with a laugh. But I remember she insisted I stamp the envelope myself. Odd thing, really. Most people don't care much for formality nowadays. Miss Marple thanked her and returned to the lane with something deeper than confirmation. Clara Eves had not only returned, she had warned Sylvia of it. A message sent, followed by a confrontation, and then a disappearance as swiftly and quietly as she had arrived. Back in her sitting room, Miss Marple turned once more to Sylvia's final letter, the one addressed to Clara. I've made the change. I know you won't agree. He may not know the whole truth, but I do. Miss Marple set it beside her teacup and took a breath. Clara had returned to stop that truth from being passed on, and in doing so, she had triggered something far more fatal than inheritance squabbles. At 6 o'clock that evening, Inspector Finch arrived at her door, hat in hand. I've been speaking with Charles Denning, he said, stepping inside at her invitation. He mentioned you believe Clara Eves may have visited. I don't believe it. Miss Marple replied calmly. I'm quite sure. She explained everything, the letter, the rose, the conversation with Florence, and Dora's quiet confession. Finch stood by the hearth, his jaw tightening. We never saw her leave. She wouldn't have used the train, Miss Marple replied. Not in daylight, not after the scream. She would have slipped out that same evening, likely by car. Perhaps someone helped her, perhaps she hired it herself. But she vanished before anyone thought to look. Finch nodded slowly. And Sylvia? Miss Marple exhaled. I believe Clara meant to frighten her, perhaps to retrieve the will. But Sylvia didn't cave. Perhaps her heart gave out, or perhaps it was a push. I doubt even Clara knew how much harm she caused. Finch sat heavily. No real evidence. No witnesses beyond Dora. And she's frightened enough already. Miss Marple picked up the rose she had taken from Sylvia's garden. She left this behind. A rose named for a man she wished to honor. But she never entered it. Because she knew Clara might see. She knew someone would object. She was waiting for the right moment. Finch stared at the bloom. So you're saying it was an argument? That turned fatal. Miss Marple nodded. But not a murder by intent. Not like Bostock feared. This was something older. A history neither woman could forgive. Silence stretched between them. Then Finch said, "If she's gone, we may never find her." "No," Miss Marple agreed, rising. "But sometimes knowing the truth is enough, even if it never sees a courtroom." Outside, the church bell rang 7. The mist had thinned, and the evening light returned in patches, glinting off windows like scattered memory. Miss Marple stood at her window and watched the rose in her vase. The tips had begun to wilt, but its center held firm. Some things, she knew, needed time to bloom. Others needed time to die. And some truths like Clara Eves vanished before they were ready to be spoken aloud. But even in silence, they left roots. Chapter 10. A truth quietly tended. A week later, peace returned to Inglewood Rise, or, at least, a version of it the villagers were willing to accept. The church bells rang in their usual gentle rhythm, and the Ropers held a modest tea in the vicarage garden to mark the planting of a new rosebed. In Sylvia Copeland's memory, the townsfolk came in careful order, hats dusted off, shoes polished, and conversation kept polite. If restrained, Mr. Bostock remained in police custody, awaiting formal charges for obstruction and tampering with legal documents. Inspector Finch had discovered that he had attempted to destroy Sylvia's revised will before her death, though he maintained he had not killed her, a technicality that spared him one fate, but not another. As for Charles Denning, he sat alone under a plum tree, a small notebook resting on his knee. He had written nothing since Sylvia's death, but his presence today was deliberate, quiet, respectful. Miss Marple approached him after most of the guests had finished their tea. "You came," she said softly. "She would have wanted that," he replied, not looking up. "She named a rose after you," Miss Marple said. He smiled faintly. "She never said." She was waiting for the right moment. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the sound of clinking cups and muted footsteps filling the space around them. "She never told me about my father," Denning said eventually. "Never once. But I think she regretted that." Miss Marple nodded. "People protect what they think they must, and sometimes, in doing so, they make wounds deeper. She tried to fix it in the end," he murmured. "With the will, the rose, everything." Miss Marple studied him a moment. She couldn't change the past, but she did what she could to ensure it wasn't repeated. From the far side of the lawn, Dora Litchfield waved gently toward Miss Marple, who acknowledged her with a nod. Dora had finally come forward to Inspector Finch with the full truth about seeing Clara Eves, about the scarf, about the confrontation. No charges would be brought against her. Finch, ever practical, had decided that justice could sometimes be served in silence. And Clara Eves, she had vanished like a shadow in fog. A quiet inquiry by Finch through Yorkshire constabularies revealed that Clara had arrived by hired car the day before the flower show and left the following evening. The driver had assumed she was attending a family funeral. No one had heard from her since. Her absence, it seemed, was her confession. Back in her cottage, Miss Marple sat with her tea and embroidery, the broken brooch now resting in a small tin marked unfinished things. It was not that the case had gone unresolved. It had merely resolved itself differently than expected. As things often did in life, Sylvia Copeland had died in her conservatory sink, not from violence, but from the slow culmination of years spent withholding the truth, tangled up in guilt, pride, and the silent dread of confrontation. Clara had come to stop her, but whether she pushed her or simply pushed too hard would never be known. Miss Marple did not need to know, for in the end, justice had been done, not in court, perhaps, but in the way the village now spoke Sylvia's name with quiet respect, and in the way Charles Denning walked with lighter shoulders. That, Miss Marple thought, was resolution enough. The final clue had not been a footprint, or a fingerprint, or even a witness. It had been a rose, unentered, unnamed, a tribute planted in secrecy, revealed by lost. And as the villagers went back to tending their hedges and arranging tea cozies, Inglewood Rise returned to its usual rhythm, never suspecting how close it had come to unraveling. Miss Marple smiled faintly and set her embroidery aside. Some mysteries, she thought, are not meant to be solved, only seen. Tended. And quietly understood. Epilogue. Beneath the surface of things, 3 weeks after the tea in Sylvia Copeland's honor, the Copeland cottage was sold. The garden, overgrown, but still noble in its chaos, stood as a silent monument to its former mistress. The roses had begun to bloom in unexpected ways, stray buds where no one had planted, thorns tangled with wild jasmine, a rose that grew halfway through the trellis arch and turned toward the sun, as if startled by its own survival. Miss Marple passed by on her morning walk, her pace steady, her straw hat firm against the breeze. She carried her knitting basket in one hand and a folded letter in the other one. She had received just that morning. The letter was from Charles Denning. Dear Miss Marple, I've decided to leave Inglewood Rise. It was never truly mine, though Sylvia tried to make it so. I am returning to Oxford for a time, perhaps even abroad, if I can find the right post. But before I go, I wanted to thank you, not only for what you uncovered, but for what you didn't say aloud. You gave me the chance to decide what to do with the truth. Sylvia raised me without ever claiming me, and though that stung, I now understand it was the only way she knew how to show love. I've kept the rose. I've taken a cutting of it, and I hope it grows elsewhere. I think she'd like that. Yours with gratitude, Charles. Miss Marple tucked the letter inside her basket and approached the edge of the Copeland property. A young couple, Mr. and Mrs. Berridge, had purchased it. Londoners, newly married, eager to trade the gray stone of the city for the supposed tranquility of the countryside. She had met them the week prior. Mrs. Berridge, wide-eyed and charming, had asked if Sylvia had been well loved in the village. Miss Marple had paused, then replied gently, she was well respected, and sometimes that is more difficult to achieve. Now, as she approached the garden gate, she found Mrs. Berridge kneeling in the soil, her gloved hands muddy, a puzzled expression on her brow. Miss Marple, she said brightly, you must see this. I've uncovered something strange. The older woman leaned over the small patch of earth, where a patch of weeds had been cleared away to reveal a cluster of shallow pottery shards. Nothing sinister, just unusual. Mrs. Berridge held up a small ceramic tag, barely the size of a coin. The faded letters read, Wintering in Silence, S.C. Miss Marple blinked, then smiled softly. A poem, she said, or a memory. Sylvia used to name her roses with phrases, some based on people she admired, others on her own thoughts. She was a woman who didn't share her secrets easily, so she planted them instead. She buried them. No, Miss Marple replied. She tended them. In her own way, Mrs. Berridge placed the tag on the stone ledge. I think we'll try to restore the garden. It has a sort of sadness to it, but also beauty. I'd like to see what's still buried beneath. Miss Marple gave a nod of approval. That would be quite fitting. As she continued her walk, the road sloping gently back toward the green, she found herself thinking not of Sylvia's death, but of her life. A woman shaped by silence, who had tried perhaps too late to offer one final truth, a truth that had arrived not through accusation, but through the slow reveal of character, memory, and time. There had been no courtroom drama, no dramatic unmasking. Clara Eves had vanished into obscurity, likely forever. Inspector Finch had closed the case officially, citing a fatal collapse under emotional duress. Brought about by an undocumented confrontation, it was an elegant way of preserving dignity. And yet, as Miss Marple knew too well, dignity was often a shroud. What mattered was what lay beneath it. She reached her gate, turned the key, and stepped inside her cottage where everything smelled faintly of lavender and sunlight. The parlor was as she had left it, a half-finished pair of socks in her knitting basket, the rose still blooming in the small vase by the window, and her notes filed neatly in a blue envelope marked Conservatory Incident. She did not dwell on the case, nor did she retell it to the neighbors. She let the village settle back into its own rhythm cakes and feats, pew polishings, whispers at the grocer's. It was not denial that kept them quiet about Sylvia's death, it was understanding. The village had absorbed the scandal and digested it, as it always did, until only the bones remained. Tucked away in private memory. On the following Sunday, Florence, now newly employed at the doctor's household, stopped by. With a jar of homemade blackcurrant jam, she looked healthier, lighter. She would have wanted someone to keep pruning the roses, she said, placing the jar gently on the counter. I suspect, Miss Marple replied, that you're doing more than pruning. You're growing. Florence smiled and left, the soft tap of her heels fading along the path. That evening, Miss Marple sat with her tea and reread the final line in Sylvia's gardening notebook. If I die, begin with the roots. It was never about revenge, nor even inheritance. It was about a buried truth, a truth that had waited long enough. Some truths burst forward like spring crocuses, eager and bright. Others sleep beneath the soil, uncertain if they will ever be safe enough to bloom. Sylvia's secret had tried to bloom too late, but even late bloomers, Miss Marple thought, changed the garden outside. A wind stirred the hedge. The roses, stubborn as ever, continued to climb.